The morning started like any other in the city, but for Officer Daniels it was going to be far from ordinary. He walked the streets with a sense of power, his uniform crisp, badge gleaming and gun holstered at his side. Daniels had always been proud of his position, feeling that authority gave him a right to command, to judge, and to make decisions on the spot without question. He had worked for years in the police force, and over time, the lines between right and wrong had blurred for him. To him, the city was a place where people needed to be controlled, and anyone who looked or acted differently was immediately suspicious in his eyes. As he walked down the familiar streets, Daniels scanned the crowd with a sharp gaze, noticing faces he didn't recognize, watching how people moved, how they carried themselves. He had grown used to making snap judgments, and over the years he had found that his assumptions rarely failed him, or so he thought. Today the sun was high, casting long shadows on the sidewalks, and the city was buzzing with life. Street vendors were setting up their stalls, the aroma of fresh bread and coffee mixing with the faint smell of car exhaust. Commuters hurried past, some nodding politely at Daniels, while others kept their distance, sensing the aura of authority that seemed to surround him. Daniels felt a sense of satisfaction as he patrolled. He liked the feeling of being in control, of being the one people looked at and moved aside for. But there was also a restless edge to him. He was always looking for something, someone, a situation that would let him assert his dominance, that would prove his power. His mind was constantly turning, imagining confrontations and outcomes that put him on top. He thrived on that tension, on the rush of having control in his hands, even if it meant intimidating those around him. That morning, as he turned a corner onto a quieter street, he noticed a man walking alone. The man was dressed neatly, in a simple but elegant suit, moving with a calm and measured pace. His posture was straight, and there was a confidence in the way he carried himself that immediately caught Daniels' attention. But instead of curiosity, Daniels felt irritation. The man looked different from the usual crowd, and in Daniels' eyes that made him suspicious. Without thinking, without any real reason, his prejudices took over. Daniels moved closer, his hand instinctively brushing the holster at his side. He felt the familiar surge of power that came with the possibility of confrontation. The man had done nothing, yet in Daniels' mind, there was already a narrative forming. This was someone who needed to be stopped, someone who might be hiding something, someone who needed to learn their place. Daniels' thoughts were clouded by years of bias, and he didn't even notice how calm and unthreatening the man actually appeared. As he approached, Daniels called out, his voice sharp and commanding. The man paused, turning to look at him, his expression neutral, almost curious. He did not flinch, did not show fear, and that only fueled Daniels' irritation. In his mind, anyone who did not immediately respond to authority was challenging it, and that challenge had to be met firmly. Without a second thought, Daniels drew his gun and pointed it at the man. The motion was quick, practiced, a display of power he had used countless times before. The street seemed to hold its breath. Pedestrians froze mid-step, sensing the sudden tension. The air felt heavier, charged with the anticipation of what might happen next. Daniels' heart pounded, not from fear, but from the thrill of control, the sense of power over another human being. He barked orders, demanding the man stop, demanding to know what he was doing, who he was, why he was here. The man, still calm, slowly raised his hands, showing that he posed no threat. His voice was steady when he spoke, polite but firm, responding to Daniels' questions without hesitation. Daniels' irritation grew. The man's calmness was an affront to his authority, a silent challenge that he could not tolerate. His mind raced, imagining what he could do next to assert dominance, to make the man comply, to remind him who was in control. He did not see the people watching, did not see the surprise and fear in their eyes, did not consider that perhaps his assumptions were wrong. All he saw was a target, a person who had dared to walk calmly in a city street, and he was going to correct that. The man continued to speak, his tone measured, his words deliberate. He seemed almost to be reading Daniels, understanding the fear and arrogance behind the gun. There was no anger, no insult, no attempt to escalate the situation. It was a demeanor that would have calmed most people, but not Daniels. He was too far into his own narrative, too convinced of his right to control, to see reason. He demanded identification, certain that this would confirm his suspicions, certain that the man was hiding something, certain that he would be proven correct. The man complied, slowly reaching into his pocket. Daniels' eyes narrowed, his mind racing with possibilities of what he might find. But when the man pulled out an identification card and calmly presented it, the world seemed to stop for Daniels. He stared, unable to believe what he saw. The card clearly identified the man as the governor of the state. The realization hit him like a cold wave, washing over him with a mixture of fear, shame, and disbelief. For the first time that morning, Daniels felt a crack in his armor. The power he had wielded so confidently, the control he had assumed was absolute, was gone in an instant. He lowered his gun, his hands shaking slightly, his face pale. The street seemed louder now, filled with murmurs and whispers, the eyes of onlookers burning into him. He had misjudged, assumed, and acted on bias, and the consequences were immediate and undeniable. The arrogance that had guided him for years had led him straight into humiliation. The man, the governor, remained calm, his demeanor unchanged. There was no anger, no yelling, only a quiet authority that contrasted sharply with Daniels' flustered state. He addressed Daniels politely, pointing out the mistake without escalation, guiding the officer toward composure. The difference between the two men could not have been clearer. One had allowed arrogance and prejudice to dictate his actions, while the other commanded respect through calmness and presence. Daniels felt the weight of the moment, the eyes of the city on him, the reality of his mistake settling deep in his chest. He had acted without thought, without consideration, without respect for another human being. And now that moment of reckoning had arrived. He would carry the memory of it, the shame and the lesson, for a long time. It was a stark reminder that authority without wisdom, power without humility, and judgment without fairness could lead to consequences far greater than he had ever imagined. As the governor continued on his way, escorted by his security team, Daniels was left standing on the street, the gun now safely back in its holster, his mind racing. He had confronted someone far above his station, someone whose patience and calm had turned the situation into a mirror reflecting his own faults. The lesson was undeniable, clear, and impossible to ignore. The city around him continued its daily rhythm, oblivious to the life-changing moment that had just occurred. But for Daniels, nothing would ever feel the same. He walked away slowly, the streets feeling different now, the people around him no longer mere subjects of authority but witnesses to his folly. The arrogance that had once driven him was replaced by a cautious awareness, a flicker of humility that would have to grow if he hoped to continue in his role without further disasters. The day had started as any other, but in a few moments it had taught him something that no years of experience could have imparted. The power of assumptions, the danger of prejudice, and the importance of respect had never been clearer, and he would never forget the calm, unwavering gaze of the man who had shown him the truth. Daniel stood on the street, his heart still racing from the encounter that had just shaken him to his core. The man in front of him had remained calm, collected and entirely unshaken, a stark contrast to his own rising panic. Daniels had pointed a gun at someone who had every right to be there, someone who had done absolutely nothing wrong. And now, with the revelation that this man was the governor, every instinct in him screamed that he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. For a moment, the world seemed to slow. Pedestrians stopped and stared, some whispering to each other, eyes wide with shock and curiosity. A few people had their phones out, capturing the scene, though Daniels was too distracted to notice. The sense of authority he had carried so confidently just minutes ago had evaporated, replaced by an intense, uncomfortable awareness of how foolish and dangerous his actions had been. The governor's calm presence was almost hypnotic. He spoke quietly with the kind of authority that didn't need to raise his voice. "Officer, there's no need for aggression. We can handle this calmly," he said, his tone firm but patient. Daniel swallowed hard, feeling a lump in his throat. He wanted to respond, to explain himself, but words failed him. The reality of his mistake left him speechless, and for the first time in years he felt powerless. The crowd began to shift, some moving closer to get a better view, others retreating to give space. Daniels felt their eyes on him, judging him, analyzing his every move. He had always prided himself on his ability to command respect, but now he realized that respect could not be demanded through fear alone. The balance of power had shifted completely. The man he had confronted radiated confidence not because of a weapon or a badge, but because of calm, measured authority and self-assuredness. Daniels had never faced anyone like this before. His mind raced through the consequences. He could see the headlines forming in his imagination. Arrogant officer confronts governor. Police officer humiliated in public incident. Bias and aggression lead to dangerous mistake. He felt a cold sweat forming on his brow, realizing that this was not just a personal failure, but a public spectacle, one that could cost him his career and reputation. His chest tightened as he considered the immediate repercussions from his superiors and the whispers from his colleagues who might have already heard about the incident. The governor didn't rush him, didn't press further. Instead, he continued to maintain his calm demeanor, giving Daniels the space to regain control over his thoughts. This patience, this quiet confidence felt almost unbearable. Daniels had been so accustomed to forcing compliance that the idea of someone teaching him a lesson through composure alone was alien. Every fiber of his being wanted to assert dominance, to regain the upper hand, but he couldn't. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that power could not be taken by force alone. As Daniels lowered his gun slowly, the governor offered a small nod of acknowledgement. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried immense weight. It reminded Daniels that confrontation was not always a battle of strength or intimidation. Sometimes it was about control over oneself, about choosing when to act and when to wait. He felt a pang of humility, though it was uncomfortable and unfamiliar. The arrogance that had driven him for so long felt like a heavy cloak he could no longer wear comfortably. "Officer," the governor said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable authority, "we can resolve this quickly if we follow proper procedure. There's no need for threats or assumptions." Daniels nodded, feeling the weight of shame pressing down on him. He wanted to apologize, to explain that his intentions had not been malicious, but the words seemed hollow, inadequate in the face of his mistake. The governor seemed to understand, however, his patience never wavering. Daniels' thoughts were interrupted by murmurs from the crowd. He realized that his actions had not gone unnoticed, and that the public perception of this encounter could be far-reaching. He felt exposed, vulnerable, and acutely aware of the difference between himself and the man before him. The governor had entered a situation without fear, without bias, and had commanded respect simply through presence and calm. Daniels, on the other hand, had relied on force and prejudice, and it had backfired spectacularly. As they spoke, a security detail quietly approached the governor, flanking him on either side. Daniels instinctively stepped back, feeling the tension in the air shift. The governor gave a small, polite wave, signaling the security team to maintain a respectful distance. It was a lesson in composure and control that Daniels would not forget. The calm efficiency of the governor and his team contrasted sharply with Daniels' chaotic, reactionary behavior, highlighting the difference between true authority and bluster. The governor continued to speak, now addressing the situation more formally. "We all have responsibilities to uphold the law and serve the public," he said, his voice measured. "But we must never allow our personal biases or assumptions to dictate our actions. Every interaction matters, and every decision carries consequences." Daniels listened, absorbing each word with a growing sense of regret. The wisdom in the governor's voice cut through the fog of arrogance that had clouded his judgment for years. For Daniels, this moment was a turning point. He had confronted someone who could have easily escalated the situation, who could have punished him, but had instead chosen patience and instruction. The realization that he had allowed prejudice to dictate his actions was both humbling and frightening. He understood now that authority was not about power over others, but responsibility toward them. Every person he encountered deserved respect, and every action he took had consequences beyond his immediate perception. The crowd began to disperse, slowly, some still whispering, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Daniels felt their gaze linger, and he understood that public accountability was a powerful force. The governor, remaining calm, nodded once more before moving away, the security detail guiding him through the street. Daniels watched him go, feeling a mixture of awe and shame. He had faced a man whose authority was inherent, not enforced, and it had completely dismantled his assumptions. As the street returned to its normal rhythm, Daniels remained in place, his mind spinning with thoughts and reflections. He replayed the encounter over and over, each time recognizing more clearly the arrogance and bias that had guided his actions. He felt a deep sense of responsibility for the near disaster he had caused, and a faint but growing determination to change. He knew it would not be easy. Years of behavior could not be undone in a single day, but the lesson had been delivered with undeniable clarity. Daniels holstered his gun fully, taking deep breaths to calm the adrenaline that still surged through his body. He looked around at the street, at the people who had witnessed the incident, and felt a new awareness of his role in the community. This was more than just a job. It was a responsibility to act with integrity, fairness, and humility. He realized that his actions could inspire trust or breed fear, and that the difference rested entirely in how he chose to conduct himself. For the first time in a long while, Daniels felt the weight of his authority in a new way. It was no longer a weapon or a shield, but a responsibility that required thought, reflection, and respect. The encounter with the governor had shaken him, but it had also opened a door to understanding, a path toward becoming the kind of officer he could be proud to be. He understood that mistakes were inevitable, but how one responded to them defined character. The city carried on around him, unaware of the profound lesson that had just unfolded on that quiet street. Daniels began to walk again, slower this time, more aware of his surroundings, more conscious of the people around him. He felt a new sense of purpose, a recognition that authority was not an entitlement but a duty, and that respect must be earned, not forced. The encounter would stay with him forever, a constant reminder of the power of humility and the danger of arrogance. It was a lesson learned in the most unexpected and unforgettable way, shaping the rest of his day, his career, and perhaps even the way he would approach life itself. Daniels felt a deep, sinking realization settle into his chest as he continued to stare at the governor, the man who had just completely overturned his assumptions and exposed the arrogance that had guided him for so long. The city street, which moments ago had seemed like a place where he wielded power effortlessly, now felt heavy, as if it were pressing down on him with the weight of judgment. The people around them whispered, some taking out their phones, capturing a moment that Daniels would never forget. The governor's calm voice cut through the tension. "Officer, I understand that you are doing your duty, but your actions must always be guided by facts, not assumptions," he said quietly, ensuring that his words were heard without causing panic or confrontation. Daniel's mind raced. He had confronted someone based on nothing more than bias and arrogance, and the consequences of that mistake were now immediate and undeniable. His fingers tightened slightly around the holster as he felt the last traces of his misplaced confidence slip away. The crowd began to take in the revelation, their whispers growing louder. Some people looked shocked, others amused, and a few shook their heads, perhaps at the officer's folly. Daniels could feel the eyes of every passerby, the invisible weight of their judgment pressing on him. He had spent years relying on his uniform, his badge, and his weapon to command respect. And now he understood that respect was fragile, built on perception, fairness, and the careful balance of authority and humility. He had ignored all of it, and now the reality of his error was undeniable. The governor continued calmly, observing Daniel's struggle to regain composure. "Every interaction we have has consequences," he said. "As officers, you are entrusted with power, but it is a responsibility, not a privilege. You cannot allow prejudice or fear to dictate how you treat others." Daniels swallowed hard, feeling a mixture of shame, fear, and realization. Each word the governor spoke resonated deeply, cutting through the arrogance that had long shielded him from self-reflection. Daniel's mind flashed back to all the times he had made assumptions about people, judged them without evidence, and acted on prejudice. Each memory brought a deeper pang of guilt. The realization that he could have escalated a situation with far more serious consequences filled him with dread. He had pointed a gun at the highest-ranking official in the state without verifying a single fact. The thought was almost unbearable. How could he have been so reckless, so blinded by arrogance? The governor noticed the visible tension and offered a reassuring tone. Mistakes happen, but the important thing is how we respond to them. Learn from this and let it guide your future actions. Daniels nodded slowly, his face pale, his usual bravado gone. There was no anger from the governor, no public humiliation beyond the unavoidable truth of the situation. Just calm, reasoned guidance. It was a lesson that authority could teach without force, without intimidation, simply through presence, wisdom, and patience. The city street seemed to close in on Daniels as he tried to process everything. He looked around, noting the expressions of the bystanders. Some were staring at him with disbelief, some with amusement, and others with quiet understanding of the lesson being played out before them. The public scrutiny was immediate and intense, and Daniels realized that his actions had not only jeopardized his career, but had also set a dangerous example for anyone watching. He felt the weight of responsibility in a way he had never experienced before. The governor remained composed, his movements deliberate and controlled. He gestured to his security team, who quietly formed a protective perimeter, allowing the governor to navigate through the crowd without causing alarm. Daniels instinctively stepped back, allowing space, feeling a mix of fear and respect. The power that the governor wielded was entirely different from the kind Daniels had relied on. It was authority rooted in presence and principle, not fear or force. Daniels tried to speak, to explain himself, but the words caught in his throat. Any attempt at justification seemed hollow, inadequate in the face of his mistake. He realized that no explanation could erase the moment. No words could undo the misjudgment. All he could do now was acknowledge the truth, internalize the lesson, and hope that he could act differently in the future. The governor's calm presence made it clear that he was not there to shame Daniels, but to teach him a lasting lesson about responsibility and humility. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, the murmurs fading into the background noise of the city, Daniels felt a profound shift within himself. He had been confronted with a mirror reflecting his own flaws, his own arrogance, and his own prejudice. The image was uncomfortable, almost painful, but it was necessary. He understood now that authority without awareness could be dangerous and that respect could not be assumed or demanded. It had to be earned, nurtured, and guided by fairness and understanding. The governor addressed Daniels one last time, his tone firm but kind. "Officer, remember this moment. Let it guide your actions and decisions going forward. Authority is not about power over others. It is about responsibility to them." Daniels nodded, feeling a mixture of gratitude and shame. The words settled in his mind like seeds, small but potent, carrying the potential to grow into lasting understanding and change. For Daniels, the encounter was a turning point, one that would shape not only his career but his perspective on life, duty, and human interaction. He had faced a situation that could have escalated disastrously, and instead, he had been met with patience, wisdom, and an example of true leadership. The lesson was clear. Arrogance and prejudice could lead to dangerous mistakes, while calm, composed authority could diffuse situations and teach lessons without conflict. As the governor moved on, escorted by his security detail, Daniels watched him go, absorbing every detail of the encounter. The calm confidence, the measured movements, the clear communication, all of it contrasted sharply with his own impulsive behavior. He felt a deep sense of humility, realizing that he had been given a rare opportunity to learn from someone who embodied the principles he had long ignored. Daniels took a deep breath, feeling the tension slowly leave his body. The adrenaline that had fueled his arrogance was replaced by reflection, by awareness, and by a cautious hope that he could change. He understood now that every action, every word, every decision carried weight, and that the consequences of bias and recklessness could be far-reaching. The encounter with the governor had opened his eyes to the reality of his own behavior, and he knew that the memory of this day would remain with him forever. As he walked back along the street, Daniels noticed the subtle reactions of the people around him. Some still glanced with curiosity, others with understanding, but the whispers and judgments no longer carried the same weight. He was aware now, more than ever, of the responsibility he held as an officer, and of the impact his actions could have on the lives of others. The lesson was unforgettable, a moment of reckoning that had turned his arrogance into awareness, his fear into understanding. and his bias into the beginning of reflection. The city continued its rhythm around him, unaware of the profound change that had occurred in one officer's heart and mind. Daniels knew that the encounter was just a moment in the life of the city, but for him it was monumental. It had revealed the dangers of assumptions, the power of calm authority, and the importance of humility. He had been humbled, corrected, and given a chance to grow, and he understood that true authority was about more than a badge or a gun. It was about character, integrity, and respect for every person he encountered. By the time Daniels returned to his patrol car, he felt a mixture of relief and determination, relief that the situation had been resolved without tragedy, and determination to never allow arrogance or prejudice to guide his actions again. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, that changing years of ingrained behavior would not be easy, but the encounter with the governor had provided clarity and purpose. He understood that he had been shown the way, and that it was up to him to follow it. As he drove off, the cityscape passing by in a blur of movement and noise, Daniels reflected on the encounter once more. The calm, authoritative presence of the governor, the quiet lesson in humility, the stark contrast to his own behavior, all of it would remain etched in his memory. The experience had shaken him to his core, but it had also given him a path forward, a chance to become the kind of officer he had never dared to imagine he could be. It was a lesson in respect, responsibility, and the power of calm authority, one that would shape his actions and decisions for the rest of his life. After the governor walked away, Daniels remained on the street, the events replaying over and over in his mind. The adrenaline that had fueled his arrogance and aggression earlier had faded, leaving a mix of shame, fear, and reflection. The whispers of bystanders had started to die down, but he could still feel the weight of their judgment pressing on him. He had faced the reality of his mistake, and now he had to confront the consequences that followed. Daniels's colleagues soon arrived, drawn by the commotion and the crowd that had gathered. Their expressions varied from surprise to quiet disapproval. Some of them had always tolerated his arrogance, but even they could see that this situation had gone too far. The officer had pointed a gun at someone without cause, someone who turned out to be the governor, the highest authority in the state. The realization made the gravity of the situation impossible to ignore. One of the senior officers approached, his tone firm but measured. "Daniels, what happened here?" he asked, already aware of most of the details. Daniels struggled to find words, the shame choking him. I misjudged the situation," he finally admitted. I thought he was a threat." The senior officer nodded slowly, understanding the explanation but also recognizing the severity of the incident. Misjudgment was one thing, but pointing a weapon at the governor was another. There were protocols, consequences, and public scrutiny to consider. Daniels was guided to step aside as the crowd began to disperse, the energy in the street shifting back to normal. He felt a deep unease, aware that this moment would not be forgotten easily. The media would eventually report on it, and the story would spread quickly. Social media would likely amplify the incident, turning his arrogance and misjudgment into a public spectacle. Daniels knew he had to prepare for accountability, and the weight of it pressed heavily on him. Back at the precinct, Daniels was met with a mix of reactions. Some officers were sympathetic, acknowledging that anyone could make a mistake under stress. Others were critical, shaking their heads at his recklessness and lack of judgment. His commanding officer called him into a private office where the atmosphere was tense and quiet. Daniels could feel the seriousness of the moment in the stern looks and measured words of those around him. "You understand the gravity of what happened?" his commanding officer asked. Daniels nodded, feeling a knot of fear tighten in his stomach. "Yes, sir, I do. I misjudged the situation and I acted on assumptions. I understand now that it could have had serious consequences." The officer's eyes studied him carefully, weighing his sincerity. "This is not just about protocol," he said. "It's about judgment, bias, and how you handle authority. You pointed a weapon at the highest official in the state, and that is not a minor mistake. There will be consequences, Daniels." Daniels felt the weight of the words, realizing that his career was now at a turning point. The incident was not just a personal failure. It was a public one, and the implications could reach far beyond the precinct. He understood that trust had been broken, not only with the governor but with the community and his colleagues. He had to face the repercussions and reflect deeply on his actions to regain credibility. The following days were filled with internal investigations and meetings. Daniels was required to give detailed accounts of the incident, explain his actions, and demonstrate awareness of the consequences. He realized that every word he spoke could influence the outcome, and he felt the pressure intensely. The disciplinary process was thorough, with the department emphasizing accountability, bias awareness, and the importance of professional conduct. Daniels found himself reflecting constantly, replaying the encounter, and understanding more clearly how arrogance and prejudice had clouded his judgment. During this period, Daniels also faced scrutiny from the public. News of the incident had spread, and community members voiced concern over the officer's behavior. There were discussions about the need for better training, the dangers of prejudice in law enforcement, and the importance of accountability. Daniels felt the weight of public opinion, recognizing that trust and respect were not guaranteed. They had to be earned through consistent, fair, and professional conduct. The incident had made it clear that power without humility was dangerous, and he was now confronted with the consequences of wielding it carelessly. In the precinct, Daniels attended workshops and sessions designed to address bias, decision-making, and professionalism. He was encouraged to reflect on the encounter with the governor and understand how assumptions, arrogance, and prejudice could escalate situations unnecessarily. The training was challenging, pushing him to confront aspects of himself he had long ignored. It was uncomfortable but necessary. Each session reminded him that authority was a responsibility, not a right to dominate, and that respect could not be forced through intimidation. As Daniels reflected on the incident, he also began to notice changes in how he approached his daily duties. He became more observant, more cautious, and more aware of the impact of his actions on the people around him. He started listening more, assessing situations carefully, and controlling his impulses. The encounter with the governor had left a lasting impression, teaching him a lesson that could not be erased. He understood that every interaction mattered, and that the choices he made could have consequences, far beyond what he initially perceived. Colleagues who had previously tolerated his arrogance began to notice a shift in Daniels. He was quieter, more reflective, and more willing to seek guidance rather than asserting dominance. His behavior began to change, not overnight but steadily. He realized that true authority required self-control, empathy, and the ability to recognize the humanity in others. The incident had stripped away the illusion of power he had relied on and replaced with the awareness of responsibility. The disciplinary process concluded with a formal warning and a requirement to complete additional training. Daniels accepted the outcome, understanding that it was fair and necessary. The experience had been a harsh but invaluable lesson, showing him the dangers of bias and arrogance in a role that demanded judgment and integrity. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, committed to improving himself and restoring trust with the community he served. In the weeks that followed, Daniels noticed subtle changes in the way people responded to him. He no longer commanded immediate deference through fear. Instead, he observed cautious respect, a reflection of his own growing awareness of the importance of integrity and professionalism. He learned to approach situations with patience, to assess threats realistically, and to act based on facts rather than assumptions. Each encounter reinforced the lesson he had learned on that quiet city street. Daniels also reflected on the governor's calm authority, the example set during the confrontation. He realized that true leadership did not rely on aggression or intimidation, but on patience, presence, and the ability to inspire respect through actions and composure. The memory of the governor's demeanor remained vivid, a guiding example of how authority could be exercised responsibly and effectively. The incident became a turning point in Daniels' career, a moment that defined his future actions and approach to law enforcement. He understood that accountability, humility, and respect were not optional. They were essential to serving the public and maintaining trust. The experience had been humbling, frightening, and enlightening, leaving a lasting impact on his understanding of authority, bias, and the responsibilities of his role. As Daniels continued his work, he carried the lessons of that day with him, applying them in every interaction, every decision, and every assessment of character. The city continued its rhythm around him, unaware of the internal transformation occurring within one officer who had been forced to confront the consequences of arrogance and prejudice. Daniels knew that he could never forget the experience, and that the lessons learned would guide him for the rest of his career, shaping him into a more thoughtful, respectful, and responsible officer. Months had passed since the incident on that city street, yet Daniels could still feel the memory pressing on him as vividly as the day it happened. The confrontation with the governor had changed him profoundly, not through punishment alone, but through the realization of the consequences that arrogance and prejudice could bring. He had learned that authority was not a privilege to be wielded recklessly, but a responsibility to be exercised with care, respect, and awareness. In the weeks following the incident, Daniels had undergone extensive training and counseling. These sessions were not easy. They forced him to examine years of behavior, biases, and assumptions that he had never questioned before. He faced uncomfortable truths about himself, about the ways he had let arrogance and prejudice guide his actions, and about how those behaviors could have endangered himself and others. The lessons were harsh but necessary. Each session reminded him that his role was to serve the public, not to assert dominance over them, and that trust and respect were earned through integrity and fairness, not fear. The public scrutiny had also been a powerful force. News reports and social media conversations had highlighted the incident, prompting discussions about accountability and bias in law enforcement. Daniels had been aware that his actions were under a microscope, and it had been humbling. He could no longer take his authority for granted, and he understood that every interaction could shape public perception and trust. This awareness became a guiding principle for him, influencing every decision he made on the job. Within the precinct, Daniels began to notice subtle shifts in how his colleagues responded to him. Some approached him with cautious respect, sensing the changes in his attitude and demeanor. Others observed quietly, waiting to see whether his transformation was genuine or temporary. Daniels knew that trust had to be rebuilt through consistent action, and he committed himself fully to that process. He became more attentive, more patient, and more deliberate in how he approached each situation, recognizing that impulsive actions and assumptions could have serious consequences. Every day offered opportunities to apply the lessons he had learned. When approaching civilians, Daniels focused on observation and communication rather than immediate judgment. He listened carefully, asked questions, and sought to understand situations before acting. The tension that had once driven his decisions was replaced by a sense of responsibility and thoughtfulness. He began to see the humanity in every person he encountered, understanding that each individual deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of appearance, background, or behavior. Daniels also reflected constantly on the governor's behavior during the incident. The calm, composed, and authoritative presence had been a stark contrast to his own impulsive and aggressive approach. The governor had demonstrated that true power came from self-control, wisdom, and the ability to inspire respect through example rather than intimidation. Daniels carried this lesson with him daily, striving to emulate that balance of authority and empathy in his own interactions. The incident became a defining moment in Daniels' career. He began mentoring newer officers, sharing the lessons he had learned about bias, judgment, and the responsible exercise of authority. His experiences provided a valuable perspective, and he approached this role with humility and patience. He emphasized the importance of assessing situations carefully, understanding the consequences of actions, and treating every individual with fairness and respect. Over time, he noticed a positive shift not only in his behavior, but also in the culture around him. Community interactions became a measure of his progress. Daniels made a conscious effort to engage with civilians constructively, resolving conflicts through dialogue and understanding rather than force. The public began to respond to his changed approach, offering cautious trust that gradually strengthened as his actions consistently reflected integrity and professionalism. He realized that rebuilding credibility was a long process, but every positive interaction reinforced the lessons he had learned on that fateful day. The governor's example remained a guiding force,